Uh, that always startles me. Thank you to Alice Poor, our executive director, who could not be with us tonight, and also Angelica Dokog for arranging this. I am excited to introduce our guest speaker for tonight. And we were establishing this before, but we were having technical issues. So please forgive my pronunciation. Dr. Biskupski, is that correct?
Biskupski.
Okay, Biskupski, forgive me. Uh, so Dr. Biskupski is a high school dropout, but nonetheless graduated summa cum laude from UCLA and received his doctorate from Yale. He is taught at Yale, the University of Rochester, and held an endowed chair in Polish studies at Central Connecticut State University, as well as holding positions as a Fulbright professor at the University of Warsaw and a fellowship at the Central European University in Budapest. He is the author of 23 books and 136 articles. He has lectured throughout Europe and North America in 3 languages, including keynote addresses at the Europe House of the EU in The Hague, the National Press Club in Washington, the Polish Film Institute in Warsaw, and the Polish Academy of Sciences. He has appeared on radio and television in both Poland and the United States. He has won many awards for scholarship, including the Polish Institute's Halecki Prize for Best Book on Polish History 4 times, as well as fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, the NEH, the Ford Foundation, the Holocaust Institute, and many others. A festschrift dedicated to him was just published in London, the work of many prominent scholars. The President of Poland presented him with the presidential plaque in 2023. He has been the president of both the Polish Institute and the Polish American Historical Association and a director of the Piłsudski Institute. The Republic of Poland has presented him with the Officer's Cross of the Order of Merit and the rarely bestowed Commander's Cross. He was awarded citizenship in the Polish Republic. He also has 5 beloved children. His family descends from Vilno and Mostovci. Please forgive my pronunciation, but it is an honor to bring to you tonight our guest speaker. So the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. I must begin by saying I'm terribly disappointed at how brief your remarks were. I was assuming they'd be 3 or 4 times as long and then be followed by a song or two, but I'll take what I can get. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Szanowni rodacy. I am pleased to speak with you and should like to begin by thanking our hosts. The fact that we're having some strange computer issues is entirely my fault because I don't know what I'm doing when it comes to anything more complicated than a fork. So here I'm absolutely speechless. As you know, my remarks were originally entitled Why I Gave Up Sumo Wrestling Because I Could Not Afford the Food. But I was asked to choose a different theme. Poland Will Never Perish suggests an emotional declaration of patriotic passion. But tonight I shall pursue a different course. In summary, my argument is that Poland's long and complex history has created a nation which is the result of several interlocked themes, which, when combined, give us something quite singular. I shall present my argument in 3 segments. War and battle. It is better to win. Romanticism is really practical, and Polish psychology, for better or worse. Let's begin with the notion of war and battle. In the late 10th century, the Poles fought a series of wars against the Germans. The Poles won. In the 13th century, the Mongols occupied what is now Russia and Ukraine for centuries, but could not occupy Poland. As a result, Russia and Ukraine became the so-called East, with Mongol influences in many ways, including a slave serf culture that has lasted and despotic rulers. Poland, by contrast, was the West, Indeed, very early in the practice began considering the eastern border of Poland to be the end of Europe. Anything beyond that was not Western, or not even European. The Poles were the guardian of the gate, the rampart of the West. In 1410, the Poles and their Lithuanian allies crushed the German Teutonic Knights at the legendary Battle of Grunwald, which ended the German advance to the east. If the Poles had lost, the Germans would have controlled much of the Baltic coast and been encouraged to further aggression and expansion. It was the largest and most significant European battle of the era. The Knights later knelt before the King of Poland and swore permanent loyalty to the Poles. In the 16th and 17th century, the Poles fought a long list of battles against Germans, Russians, Swedes, Tatars, Turks, and others. The Poles, who were always outnumbered, often enormously, never lost a major battle. They eventually fought scores of battles. Some say there might have been 200 of them. Let us note a few striking examples, and I'll say why I'm doing this in a few minutes. In 1514, at the Battle of Orsha, the Russians had 40,000 men, though perhaps even more. The Poles had fewer, not quite 30,000. The Russians, however, were crushed. 50% of their troops were killed or captured, including all their commanders. The Poles announced that the Russians were not Christians. They're not even Europeans, they're just Asiatic barbarians. King Stefan Batory, who ruled in the late 16th century, he was elected to the throne. Uh, uh, no kings, by comparison, were elected in France or England, and certainly not Russia or the German states. But more than later. The Russians invaded Poland in about 1576, but were thrown back by the Poles, who pursued them far to the east. Batory defeated Ivan the Terrible and the Livonian Wars that followed. Let's see. Almost immediately thereafter, the Swedes invaded Poland and fought one of the most extraordinary battles of the era. You bear with me, I'm going to give you a few battles. You might say, good Lord, I don't remember all those, or I do remember all those. The Battle of Kirchholm in 1605. The Swedes had 11,000 soldiers, the Poles only 3,600. But the Poles lost only 100, while the Swedish losses were 8,000. The battle lasted 20 minutes. Why so brief? The Polish victory was a result of a cavalry charge, the so-called winged hussars, which we shall discuss. Once the Poles broke the line, the Swedes tried to flee, but by turning around, they faced the line behind them of their own troops, and the result was disaster. A few years later, the Russians invaded, but unfortunately for them, they had to face the Polish cavalry again, the Battle of Klushin. The Poles had about 6,500 men, the Russians 30,000. The Poles lost 200. The Russian casualties are estimated at 15,000. Again, the hussars, the cavalry. The Poles then chased the Russians to Moscow, which they then occupied. The Poles chose, or at least had a large role in choosing, the new Tsar. The Russian rulers were required to kneel before the Polish king. Shortly thereafter, 24,000 Russians sieged the Polish city of Smolensk in 1632. The Poles had 2,000. The Russians were defeated, as they were earlier in the same place in 1609. The Russians were repeatedly beaten with enormously higher casualties over the next few decades. 1683 gives us the most famous Polish victory of all time, I suppose, the crushing defeat of the Turks at Vienna. King Jan Sobieski led the decisive Hussar charge that defeated them. The Turks lost 20,000, and at least 10,000 more were captured. The Poles and their allies lost only 4,500. A few years before, Sobieski had defeated the Turks in the Battle of Horchin. Just a few years before, he lost 2,000, the Turks 30,000. It was a preface to Vienna. Had the Turks won at Vienna, which seemed certain until Sobieski's troops arrived, the Turkish expansion into Europe would have continued. How far is still debatable. Would Central Europe have become part of a Turkish Islamic state? Perhaps. But the threat to the West was ended at Vienna. European history was recast. Poland's role was central. As one of my students once said to me, we saved the world again. At the end of the 18th century, Poland, in decline after so much was lost, some have suggested that the Polish population during these wars decreased by 30%. In other words, 1/3 of the population of Poland was exterminated in the series of wars. And at the end of the 18th century, Poland was invaded and occupied by its three powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, later identified as Germany, and Austria. This was the so-called partitions of Poland, which removed Poland from the map for 123 years. During this dreadful era, the Poles launched a series of risings against the Russians. All were crushed. and the Russians were famous for massacres of civilians, deportations to Siberia, and virtual enslavement of the population. Finally, in 1918, the Poles regained their independence due to the chaos of World War I, but were invaded by Russia, now a communist country. The culmination was the Battle of Warsaw of 1920, with Józef Piłsudski, the greatest Pole of modern times. He's also my hero, and usually I have several pictures of him on the wall, tattooed on my back and in my shirt cuffs and many other places. Piłsudski, as I said, the greatest Pole of modern times, if not more than that, crushingly defeated the Russians who fled, a departure which became chaos when the Polish cavalry caught them at the Battle of Komarów, the last major cavalry charge in all history. In one of the battles, Piłsudski, this is a fascinating episode, and luckily we have 2 or 3 witnesses to it, so it's true. In one of the battles, Piłsudski stood up even though enemy bullets were landing all around him, and his soldiers were trying to have him seek cover. His response was extraordinary. "Do not worry, I have an appointment with destiny for Poland." And he never sat down, but he continued to lead the march with his sword drawn, his charge. The Battle of Warsaw is increasingly regarded as of enormous consequence for European history. What if communist Russia had won? Where would they be stopped? Would communism have spread dramatically after that? Perhaps. Only a generation later, World War II resulted in Poland's defeat and occupation by the Russians and Germans. Many battles were fought, some quite famous, like Westerplatte or Bzura, but they were isolated and ineffective. The English and French
And
Polish
at the
allies.
Polish Center.
Used to be?
There, I don't know how, there's some other people on Zoom somewhere from there, but
The person talking may not have their camera on.
oh, he might not be in camera.
Oh, hi, Miss Jenny. Would you mind muting? Thank you. Okay.
Can I go on?
Okay, yes.
Yes. As I say, only a generation later, World War II resulted in Poland's defeat and occupation by the Russians and Germans. There were a few minor Polish victories, but they didn't slow the war. The English and the French, Poland's allies, who had promised to aid Poland, did absolutely nothing, and later joined by the Americans, ignored Poland throughout the war, or even cooperated with the Soviet Union in destroying the country. The meaning of the war in Polish history is symbolized in the 1944 Warsaw Rising, which probably all of you have heard, in which the Poles tried to liberate their capital from German occupation. Many children served in the Polish ranks, including those as young as 11. It has become a symbol of martyrdom that lingers in Polish consciousness. This is only a handful of examples. Some scholars, as I mentioned, argue that Poland fought 200 battles, and I've only given you half a dozen, but they allow us to create some larger conclusions. First, the extraordinary role played by cavalry in Polish history, whether the Hussars of the earlier centuries or the Ulany of later years. The cavalry was an incomparable military force, almost never defeated. Some claim that it did not lose a single battle in 150 years. What's really important is its role as symbol. All Hussars, for example, were nobles, trained in cavalry tactics and maneuvers since they were children. Riding horses, also carefully prepared for combat over the years. When they took the field, they were already professionals, raised in a life of military training and passionate and consuming patriotism. This created the so-called cavalry mentality, which has lingered for centuries. It was long called the Sarmatian tradition, a term that's not widely known, which argued that the Polish cavalry really had ancient roots, is noble by descent, and discounts numbers. Note the extraordinary differences I purposely mentioned in my discussion of the battles. Often the Poles were fighting enemies much larger than they were and inflicted casualties much greater than they suffered. Sarmatianism is a fascinating phenomenon which appeared in Poland perhaps in the 15th century. It posits the arrival in ancient Poland of a large contingent of mounted soldiers from what is now Iran. They were described as tall, fair, and having blue eyes. They were also ferocious. The Sarmatians settled in eastern Poland and became a class of noble warriors who were the basis for the evolving Polish nobility. With their garb, uniforms, weapons, and customs, they wore long robes, had no sideburns but large mustaches, became elements of Polish culture, and resulted in Poland becoming a distinct portion of Europe. It became popular for Poles to refer to their country as Sarmatia. The centering of the cavalry in Polish tradition meant the centering of the nobility. A large percentage of the population, the percentage of the population in Poland that was noble was higher by far than any other European country. The nobility's enormous role in Polish history is reflected in the oft-recorded remarks by a foreign visitor to Poland who was struck by the pride and the arrogance of the Polish nobility. A boast from the 16th century has a minor Polish nobleman, a Szlachcic to be sure, saying, quote, "A humble Polish gentleman sitting on a fence is more important than an English prince," which I think is still true today, but that's another matter. This had lasting consequences. If we look at drawings or descriptions of Polish knights or nobles for centuries, they do not look like Western Europeans, say French or English. The Poles were distinctive in dress and manners. The result was usually overlooked. In the 14th to 18th century, the Poles had a very fascinating understanding of themselves. The territory to the west was Western Europe. The territory of the east, largely Russia, was not really Europe at all, but Euro-Asia. Poland was neither. Poland was, well, Poland. It was not a country really, but a civilization, and that's how the Poles referred to themselves. Poland's not a country, it's a civilization. Sarmatianism was the first step in the Polish inclination to detach themselves from both West and East and regard themselves as neither. Poland was Poland. The idea that Poland was determined to be part of the West is really a more modern phenomenon which reflects the decline of Poland. Once Poland became ruined by the partitions and economically backward compared to the rest of Europe, its only choice was to westernize. This, though inevitable, has some unfortunate consequences. A growing feeling of inferiority and insignificance, which I should argue is beginning finally to fade. But for a long time, the Poles thought of themselves as being behind the rest of Europe. And I might add, and this is not a very happy thing to say, many Western Europeans and Americans had a tradition of looking down at the Poles as being a second-rate civilization. Pre-partition Poland referred to itself as a noble republic, Rzeczpospolita. Poland is a republic because the nobility was dominant for so many centuries. This resulted in their gaining wealth and power, but far more important and lasting, it made the nobility the embodiment of Polish culture. Poles, at least some, still kiss ladies' hands, still call each other pan, which is more than just sir, is something rather higher. You can become a noble regardless of your ancestry. Let me give you an example of that. This concerns Tadeusz Kościuszko, whom you've probably all heard of. He was famous for his role in the American Revolution. Kościuszko also fought ferociously against the Russians after the American Revolution. At the striking 1794 Battle of Slavica, Kościuszko's troops were facing defeat when suddenly a flood of peasants carrying farming scythes appeared in the field, smashed the Russian lines, and gave Kościuszko the victory. The peasant leader, Bartosz, was immediately ennobled by Kościuszko on the battlefield. After that, he was Pan Bartosz, a nobleman. The Polish cavalry tradition is unique and is epitomized by the already mentioned Hussars. Let us consider their unusual performance. Hussar wore armor and was mounted on a horse which was also armored. On the saddle and attached to the back of his uniform was an enormous wooden frame towering above him. On the frame, many eagle and hawk feathers were attached, making him appear striking. The winged hussars, one of the most extraordinary formations of military history, was awe-inspiring when it moved towards you. When the hussars went into battle, they began stretching over a long front, but as they approached the enemy, they tightened their ranks and increased their speed. The enemy tried to stop them with lines of defenders, pikemen, sword bearers, but the Poles had prepared for this by attacking with a lance 18 feet long. Now you might ask, how in the world can a person carry an 18-foot-long oaken lance? And the answer is, they hollowed it out, so the weight was much lighter than you might think. The enemy tried to stop them with lines of defenders, pikemen, and sword bearers, but the Poles had prepared for this by attacking, as I say, with an 18-foot-long lance, which meant that the lance hit the enemy before the Poles were within the reach of the enemy. This long weapon, the roar of the winged saddle, and absolute confidence they would attack a much larger opponent without concern for numbers, terrorized the enemy. Once the Poles broke through the first rank, the enemy was pushed back by turning around and fell into their own troops behind them. Frequently, the defenders, seeing battlefield chaos develop, occasionally turned about, dropped their weapons, and fled. This was a disaster for them because a fleeing soldier was helpless with a hussar upon him. The hussar, would drop his lance, grab a huge sword, the carabella, then, next a mace, then a pistol, then a crossbow, and then a number of throwing knives. Khazar was effectively an attacking squad, not just one man. The Tsars were tactically brilliant, but their psychological dominance over the enemy was even more important. It is not surprising that they create a legendary place in Polish history and consciousness. The Hussars, a symbol of Polish greatness and symbols, have had a striking important role in Polish tradition. They were widely pictured, as you might have noticed, 2 days ago in the celebration of Polish independence, and portraits of the Tsars have been used to our own day. And I think I probably have one someplace or other that I've lost. Alas, Poland's position, once the largest country in Europe with strikingly modern political practices, declined in the 18th century for economic and political reasons. It was a target of constant attacks by its neighbors, the Russians, Germans, Swedes, Turks, and others, what is called potop, or deluge in English. For more than a century, Poland was occupied. Poles were treated at best. Inevitably, increasing numbers of the population began to wonder whether Poland was in a hopeless decline, was doomed, would disappear from the imagination of Europe and the consciousness of the Poles themselves. The partitions were a disaster. In the late 19th century, a sad time, a new generation appeared convinced that Poland could be reborn. The essence of this was Piłsudski, a man I mentioned before. The escape from despair was, Piłsudski imagined, not diplomacy or politics, but to reconstruct the military tradition. He always wore a uniform and understood Polish history by the study of war. He played the major role in reestablishing a free Poland in 1918, built around the soldier tradition, the lancer, the charge, noble dignity, and incomparable arrogance. One of the major results of the noble cavalry notion is that it gives the noble theme a key role in forming and maintaining the Polish tradition. This meant far more than grandeur. Centuries before America existed, Poles, the Szlachta, could vote in national elections. About 6%, maybe as many as 10% of the nation could vote. They had a functioning parliament, the same. They elected their kings and had guarantees of rights by ancient documents. Once the king was elected, he was required to sign a contract, the Pacta Conventa, which outlined the rules and traditions which he must follow. Should he fail to do so, he would be effectively impeached. By 1569, Poland was called Rzeczpospolita Polska, the Polish Republic. Was there another? No. No other large state in Europe was a republic. Poland was a republic before there was an American Declaration of Independence or Constitution. In England, for example, as late as 1830, only about 3% of the population was allowed to vote. The Catholics couldn't vote, Jews couldn't vote. A voter in Poland could be a Catholic, a Protestant, a Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, German, or other origin. Fine, he could vote. Slavery was illegal, and if you brought a slave to Poland with you, he was freed upon your crossing the Polish border. Hence, war and battle played a significant role in shaping the Polish mentality. Pride, confidence, patriotism, fine manners, and rule and governance were all noble warrior aspects. They were also the elements which shaped much of the nation, which was non-noble. The Sarmatian tradition, which became mythologized and deeply embedded in the Polish mind. Now, let's turn to the role of Romanticism in the Polish nation. Romanticism, by which I mean ideas and thoughts, not chasing your girlfriend across the room, appeared in Europe late in the 18th century and lasted about 50 years. It then faded, returned, and elements have lasted to our own day. In Poland, the appearance of Romanticism is a crucial phenomenon. It arrived in the Polish mind at the very time the partitions were taking place and lasted a very long time. In fact, I would argue it still exists today. European Romanticism is a reaction to the era of the Enlightenment which preceded. The Enlightenment caused increasing numbers of people, they have reduced their lives to soulless practicality. I'm not a fan of the Enlightenment, so I'm just a helpless romantic, so I hope you'll forgive me. It removed emotion, sentiment, dreams, and religion and replaced them with numbered calculation. The Enlightenment modernized Europe, to be sure, and did many positive things, but it attacked the unspoken traditions that had formed it. Poland's Romantic Age was unique and has influenced Polish civilization and understanding. As a result, we see a wave of Polish poets and artists, political theorists, and popular champions who invoked, read my hand instead of paper, who invoked a dreamy, sentimental world which required emotional attachment, mystical figures walking by streams in the forest, faraway territories that never existed, all somehow beyond practical understanding. References to heart, soul, imagination became a major force in the Romantic age. The eastern territory of pre-partition Poland was looked upon as somehow more Polish than the rest of the country. The land of warfare, pulling the enemies from the east at bay, vast countryside, noble horsemen. The frontier region, the Kresy, were regarded as the center of noble warrior Poland. And that's true into the 20th century. That's one of the reasons that Poles are so fascinated with Ukraine and even more Lithuania. The Kresy, borderlands, was really the Polish version of the Wild West for Americans. But the cowboys were in Poland noblemen. The East was what made Poland different from the rest of Europe and was frequently cited in Romantic writings. Piłsudski, again, the champion of restored Poland, was from the Kresy. My family is too, but I have made rather few conquests in my life. Polish Romanticism was a means of saving a broken spirit, reanimating the heart, and convincing the Poles that they were different, indeed superior to their neighbors. They had a unique tradition which the Romantics would invoke, often wandering off into the mists of legend, mystery, myth, and occasionally nonsense. Poets like Mieczyslaw, Slowacki, Krasiński, composer, pianist Chopin, even scholars and political figures epitomize this. Perhaps a couple of examples to illustrate this. Adam Mickiewicz's most famous work, Pan Tadeusz, begins with an address to historic Poland, telling that it was the basis of health. Poland was the basis of health, the Polish Commonwealth, the Polish Republic, and only he who has lost it knows how important it is. Slowacki talks of a spirit floating through time and place, who at various times becomes human and leads the nation. Their meaning, which is clear, Poland will be saved by forces beyond human ability. It is the agency of the mysterious, perhaps divine. Almost immediately, themes began to appear which would be called messianism and the chosen people notion. There are, of course, elements of these romantic themes that may appear delusional, even perhaps blasphemous. We can only understand these notions if we focus on the context in which they appeared. Could you really be a Pole if there was no Poland? To solve this dreadful situation, the Romantics spoke about Poland of the spirit, a Poland of, I just lost my page, here it is, a Poland of the soul. If Poland exists in memory, in the heart, it exists. Poland is immortal and therefore can never perish. As a result, some Romantics made the argument that to really explain Poland's tragedy, if you move into a very mysterious and odd territory, to really explain Poland's tragedy, we must focus on the life of Christ. He existed, he was betrayed and sacrificed and removed from life. But was he really? No. To continue with the heart and mind, he rose from crucifixion and his glory was eternal. If we recognize and celebrate his singular meaning and significance, we shall not be not just informed, but we shall see the truth. We shall be saved. You must devote yourself to God, keep the faith. Hence, now you must have faith in Poland, which exists in heart and mind, though not in reality. Poland was partitioned, essentially the crucifixion, therefore, was elevated to a divine status, with faith in regaining a free Poland, and will one day reemerge in a singular form. Poland's rebirth will be a sort of second coming. Late in the 19th century, a dying poet in Paris was surrounded by his dear ones. His last words to the weeping gathered round him were, and I quote, and there are witnesses to this, is not some nonsense, "Hope forever, Poland will be reborn on the arms of the cross." A few decades later, Piłsudski, whom I've mentioned repeatedly, who was an atheist, referred to Poland regaining independence in 1918 as zmartwychwstanie, resurrection. Isn't that odd that a reference to an atheist would use a reference to resurrection? I guess it's because he was an atheist, but he was a Polish atheist. The partitions are thus the geopolitical version of the crucifixion, and faith in God is the model for faith in Poland. Hence, emergent Polish patriotism shows two powerful shaping influences. The Poles lacked any means of evicting the enemy, so Poland could only reappear by the power of faith, by recognizing the fate of Poland has already been shown to us in the New Testament. So the partitions cannot be ended by force, but only by divine intervention. As was popular in the 19th century among Romantic poets and others, Poland is the Christ of nations, as one Romantic wrote. In other words, Poles must believe in Poland, or it's gone. So a practical problem was addressed by very mysterious invocations of spirits and gods, prayers and faith. The Polish Romantic lasted very long. Some have argued that it's permanent, but let's be blunt and practical. What were the Poles' alternatives? Believe in Poland or accept the disappearance of this extraordinary nation? Thus, embracing romanticism is a strategy to oppose the consequences of partition. Patriotism resting on desperation but animated by hope and loyalty is very profound indeed. It is not like any other European country. And finally, my third theme, Polish psychology, for better or worse. In his extraordinary 1901 play Wesele, The Wedding, Stanisław Wyspiański tells us all we need to know about his understanding of Poland. In his play Wesele, a little girl arrives at a wedding. Confused, she has grown up in a world in which Poland did not exist, and therefore she's confused about where it might be. So she asks one of the guests, "Where's Poland?" He places her hand on her heart. There is Poland. Later, Wyspiański invokes a strange, ghost-like figure who tries to rouse the Poles to battle and heroism. He is a spirit from the Kresy. It is useful to note that Wyspiański was a close friend of Pilsudski and gave him enormous amounts of money to raise a Polish army. He did, and they played a significant role in Polish history thereafter. They are known as the legions. They're still represented in parades in Poland, including 2 days ago. We saw many cities had versions of the legions parade through the streets. Polish national psychology has a number of striking elements. First, it has great pride, even arrogance, conviction of superiority, uniqueness, and having a special role to play in history. But simultaneously, it has dismal memories of being destroyed and occupied by its neighbors, spending years in sad obsolescence, crushing poverty, war, German and Russian occupation in World War II, endless massacres, and more than a generation of communism, which is both horrible and ridiculous. These long years of failure and despair are difficult to compromise with the glory of the old Polish Republic. How does the Polish mind combine two contradictory inheritances? Another visit to Pilsudski. When Poland was regaining its independence, supporters in the West, including England, France, and the United States, endorsed the idea of independence for Poland. But the meaning of the word was, and still is, vastly different for Poles than it is for Westerners. For Poles like Pilsudski, the basis of his comment, and I'm quoting Pilsudski, "Poland will be great or will not be." To the West, this sounds like arrogance or even megalomania, but it's simply logic. If you have a large, powerful, and historically aggressive Germany on one side and a huge imperialist autocratic Russia on the other, can you survive if you do not have the resource to defend yourself? No. The Great Poland is large, powerful, and influential. Great does not mean arrogant, it is practicality. When Poland was large and powerful, it was secure. When it declined, it was imperiled and eventually destroyed. Pilsudski was, in his use of the term great, simply saying we must be strong enough to defend ourselves. That's not arrogance, it's common sense. Pilsudski preached a simple but vital lesson. If you do not remember your past, you have no present and deserve no future. Frequently quoted passage from Pilsudski. Unfortunately, we cannot conclude that this instruction has remained in all Polish minds to the present day. A difficult question to be sure. Does the enormous recent celebration of Polish independence just 2 days ago incline us to conclude that Polish patriotism and pride are still powerful forces, or is this too optimistic? In other words, Poland will never perish, but that means that Poland must be, to its core, Polish. The embodiment of national history and tradition, national pride and loyalty. And I would remind you that loyalty is what the great Polish novelist Joseph Conrad once called the Polish virtue. The legacy is that a contemporary Pole has a unique past, a long history, centuries as a huge state playing a major role in Europe, a tradition of heroism and sacrifice, a political system more advanced and modern than any other state in Europe in the Middle Ages, and even more important than pride and boast, it is the result of so many dreadful moments. In retrospect, we have this. Poland survived ruin and destruction because the Poles never ceased to be Polish. They never surrendered their national culture, their national traditions. Being Polish is really a religious phenomenon. Poland does not need to be the Christ among nations, as the Romantics wrote. But if it's all destroyed, only faith allows you to survive defeat, occupation, and betrayal. Poland will never perish because Poland is not simply a country, but an icon of historic greatness, charging hussars, great victories, unmatched national pride. The Poles have always sought greatness. They long had it, and it has never left their spirit. Poland will never perish because Polskość, Polishness, shall be by the grace of God forever. Thank you. I'm looking at you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, of course. Glad to go.
You're a wonderful speaker. I wish I would have had you as a professor in some of my courses.
Well, what a nice thing for you to say.
If it's okay with you, I would like to open up the floor for anybody who has questions or comments.
Would you like me to sing?
Well, I would like to ask you, you touched on Kosciuszko, which at the Polish Heritage Center, we're in Panna Maria, we have a special, we honor him. He has a special portrait. We recognize him. I would like to ask you more about the virtues of Poland, the dignity, the chivalry, the loyalty, which Kosciuszko coming to fight for during the American Revolution. Can you speak more to why he brought these virtues over to the colonists?
Well, Kosciuszko was a nobleman from the East, Kresy, and he was aware of what was going on in the pre-American or pre-United States America, and he concluded that what the Americans are doing is a good cause, and that they have advocated principles which are matched nicely with the Polish Republican romantic tradition. And he came to the United States, and we have to keep in mind that Kosciuszko, in addition to his knightly behavior and military prowess, Kosciuszko was also someone who had been educated in military engineering in Paris. So when he came to the United States, he was something that the Americans didn't have, and that was had extraordinary technical capacities. It was Kosciuszko, for instance, who did put barriers in the Hudson River near West Point to prevent the British from going south and attacking New York. Of course, if his construction efforts had failed, a friend of mine from Purdue University has argued that the British might very well have taken Manhattan. Would the Americans have lost the war because of that? Well, it's not impossible. So Kosciuszko showed himself to be not only a heroic fellow, but also a very, very useful technical contributor to the American Revolution. Was highly regarded, and he returned to Poland. He was given quite a nice send-off by the Americans, and not long after he returned to Poland, he immediately found himself in command of Polish soldiers fighting against the Russians, and the key battle of Rasławice, which I already mentioned, which was a Polish victory. But unfortunately, shortly thereafter was the Battle of Maciejowice, where the Poles were defeated, and Kosciuszko was forced to leave and spent the rest of his life living in Switzerland in exile.
Lauren?
Yes, John.
Dobry wieczór, Polak.
Dobry wieczór.
John Sobrowski here from Glastonbury. Are you still do you still live in Hebron?
Yes, I do, Don.
It's great to hear your voice.
Thank you.
I just wanted to get on briefly, and I see you have just a few members of the Polish Heritage Center board of directors here, and I'd like them to all know that you, as well as Professor Jim Pula, who I see on here, were extremely helpful in editing some of the elements in the early Polish history elements in our Heritage Center. And want to thank the both of you gentlemen. There was others who contributed as well, but since I have the two of you here, I think it's very appropriate to recognize the both of you. And thank you both. Thank you both so very, very much for making the Polish Heritage Center what it is. We greatly appreciate it. Bolek, I hope to see you someday up there. God bless you in your retirement.
Well, God bless you too, John. I appreciate that remark. And to be not to be self-congratulatory, but for 22 years, I ran the Polish Studies program at Central Connecticut State University.
I know.
And from the time I started that, my view was always not only do I teach classes and write books, but I also have to be available to the Polish community in the United States to help them with things with support Polish. Because as you probably noticed, although I perhaps not, I'm something of a Polish patriot. So as a consequence of that, I owe something to Polonia as part of my Polish heritage.
You've done it. You've been an incredible addition, both of you guys, an incredible addition to American Polonia in getting the truth, getting the story out there. And you both deserve an immense amount of credit for what you've done. And my gosh, I just thank you both so very, very much.
Well, thank you, John. If I can respond with an anecdote that happened to me, I think you might find this fascinating. I have 5 children, and the youngest is my son, is a student at George Washington University in D.C. And a few weeks ago, I was visiting him and some of his friends, and we were driving through the streets of Washington. And one of the other fellows in the car said, "Oh, isn't it the Polish embassy over there?" And it was. We were driving by it. And my son, without any hesitation, sang the Polish national anthem.
Bardzo dobrze. Oh, that's great. Well, I hope to see you up there in Connecticut some days. I'm going to be up that way early next year. And, you know, Lilia Keltika from the Greater Cultural Center of Hartford, I'm sure. And so I've got some business up that way. So hope to see you. And
that would be nice.
God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We have a hand up from Bożena.
Yes, good evening, everyone. What an interesting presentation, Professor Biskupski.
Oh, thank you.
And I also have gone to your daughter's presentation several years ago here at the University of Maryland. I'm actually in the Washington, D.C. area. And since I heard that your son is studying here, we'd like to invite him to the Polish community here, which is centered around Our Lady Queen of Poland Parish in Silver Spring, Maryland. But I also have a question for you, or actually, if you would have a comment on this. And I wanted to ask you, how important is it to know Polish to be able to foster this identity through generations? Now, you know, to different degrees of knowing Polish, because we hear of communities that have are several generations old, for example, in Brazil, and they still speak Polish in some areas. So there are Polish Saturday schools, as you know, as well as very few universities nowadays offer Polish as a language that one can study. So do you have some opinion or some helpful hints on how best to, because the reason I ask this question is because you get a little bit different flavor, a little different perspective when you hear something in Polish versus when you read the translation, and that can make a difference. So I'll just be quiet and let you speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very important point. Is knowing the Polish language required for you to be, shall we say, Polonized, or to be really Polish? And I would say it's a very important element. There are people who love Poland who can't speak Polish. I've known some of them, and there's some in history that are recognizable. Therefore, the question is, how do you pass on knowledge of the Polish language to your family members, your children, et cetera, et cetera? That's not easy because they live in an English-speaking world, and consequently, the opportunities to speak Polish are rare. So it's a hard job for the other members of the family. Obviously, the first thing you need to do is have someone in your family who does speak Polish. Then you can do things like take online courses in Polish. But my experience is that very few youngsters want to take online courses in a foreign language, no matter what it is. Then there are Polish schools here in New Britain, for instance. There's a Polish Saturday school, and there are others like that. What I had my son do, and he was 2-3 years ago, is he went to Kraków as a scholarship from the Kościuszko Foundation to study Polish there, and he was there for several weeks and learned a lot of Polish, and came back and has still gotten better and better. Now his Polish is very, very good, and several other of my children speak Polish. So, is it important to learn Polish? Yes. Is it necessary? We're getting close, but it's better to be Polish in the heart than on the tongue.
Thank you.
Of course.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions?
If I may say one more thing, if it,
Of
I
course.
would like to invite Professor Biskupski's son. If he needs information, we can send him the information about our community here.
Yes, I could give you his email number if I knew it offhand. Could I do this? Could I send Stasia's, his name is Stanislav, could I send Stasia's email address to our host and she could pass it on to you?
Yes, you could send it to either Lauren and I and Rosanna. We could send it to, we'll forward it to you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anybody else have any comments or questions?
Yeah, I have something else that I want to ask you about. And that's, for example, we have the diaspora here in the Washington, D.C. area, and we have several well-known Polish patriots buried in different cemeteries. Now, you'd never know it because there are no markers to that effect to alert anyone. And many of the cemeteries, or some of them, are open spaces so that if someone comes in and sees a plaque, for example, we live near a very historic cemetery, Bishop Carroll, the first cardinal of Maryland. His mother is buried here, and when you walk in, you see that Bishop Carroll was here, and that's about the only information you have. But farther in a different corner, you have some Polish patriots who were active in the Warsaw Uprising, who were active in the underground, who are buried there. And we do have actually people from the embassy who come and honor them with flowers and on Memorial Day, or on near November 1st or 2nd. But the fact is that it's an open place, and people just, people who jog through it or walk through it, because there's a big grassy area on one side that is very, very comfortable for walking, or even playing frisbee, as some people have done. But there's no marker there. What kind of marker would be appropriate? What kind of it's a designated as a historic area.
Mm-hmm.
We're just wondering what kind of marker, and maybe this is something that needs to be actually thought about, but I thought I would just throw it out and maybe ask for your comments now or later if you wanted to contact me about what would be good, so that it would alert people that there is what we call in our anthropology or archaeology a contested history. So it's not just one history, it's history that was former and that's more current now, that has other inputs.
Mm-hmm. Well, my response would be that because symbol is so important in the Polish mind and in Polish history, you should have some sort of symbol that would speak particular to Poles, and perhaps others would not be able to recognize it. But that's all right; it's for us. For instance, a Polish eagle, a very distinctive version of an eagle. That might be enough. Just a Polish eagle and just or Polska or Poland under it, or maybe not any word at all, because people would look at it and say, "What's that?" You say, "Well, that's the eagle of Poland." So you open the conversation.
This is for people who would not have anybody to explain to them what that means. For example, it's a very diverse neighborhood. So people don't know, the history of, and they're not that much interested, I think, in looking it up or Googling it or anything. But I think there was a little plaque or something that maybe described that here in this corner of the cemetery are buried some people who fought in World War II in Poland for Poland's freedom, something like that. It maybe needs to be refined.
I think you're right. I think you're right, because once people come there, it probably would be useful if it's technically able to be placed there. There's some small plaque with just a few sentences about who these people are and why that's important.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, Rosanna, I could speak to you separately too, because I've done some markers for in other places that I've worked. And so there's a number of things because that we could talk separately about that, because they'll just require a little lengthy conversation, and then we could bring in others to talk about. Because right now, what I'm working on is a virtual component to some of the cemeteries. I'm in Virginia now. And so I think now there's a lot of creative ways that can be done to share the information. But I know exactly where you're talking about, because I was actually just there a couple of weeks ago. And I noticed that as well, because I had friends who live in the neighborhood who told me about that. They're the ones who took me there, since they know that, my interest and my love for Polish history. So they said, "Did you know this?" And I said, "Oh my gosh, no, I had no idea." But anyhow, but you're right. It should be, recognized. And Mark, didn't you include some of those individuals in one of your presentation?
Yeah, well, I guess as an example, Chaim Solomon, the American Revolutionary War banker, his grave is a relatively modest one in Philadelphia in the Jewish cemetery there. So yes, to Bozano's point, there's definitely an opportunity to highlight that, as well as maybe the many Polish Americans who fought in our throughout our history. For example, here in Minnesota, I guess kind of echoing that theme of heroism, one of the first pilots to die at the Battle of Midway was a Polish American whose father also was a major force in recruiting people in World War I. So there's kind of a broader theme there of that heroism extends to the diaspora as well, that you mentioned, Dr. Biskupski.
If there are no more questions or comments, we can start wrapping up. Dr. Biskupski, did you have anything else you would like to add?
Yes, I'd like each of you to send me $25 in an envelope tomorrow, and I'll collect it all, and on the basis of that, I'll be able to buy alcohol for the rest of my life.
We'll be sure. We'll have to get your address.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Thank you. No, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope my presentation was interesting to all of you, and I was happy to do it. And since I'm an egomaniac being Polish, I'll I was grateful for the invitation, and I hope you're satisfied.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you and everyone for attending. We will have this available probably in the next few days on our website and Facebook. And I would also like to add, next month we will be featuring Dr. Jim Pula again for a presentation, and I will have those details also on our Facebook and website, hopefully in the next days to come. It'll be up there soon with all the details in the Zoom link. And so with that, I would like to invite Al for closing remarks, please.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Dr. Biskupski. I have to tell you that I want to echo what John Sobrowski said. You and Jim Pula were tremendous aids to us and the bishop. I know he was very thankful for the time you all spent going over some of the details of our stanchion and exhibits. And so again, our thanks to you.
Thank you.
So on behalf of the board, I wondered how it would work out with just a voice and not a face. I'd rather have had both, but it worked out well. So thank you so much for plowing through and educating us on as you did. So I'll close with a prayer in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Dear Lord, we thank you and ask your blessings on all those that were here watching this visual. And we thank you for all the gifts you've given us in this Thanksgiving season. It's appropriate for us to thank for our heritage, our Polish heritage, and other heritages. But most especially, we thank you, Lord, for having us here today, and that we may do your will. Amen. In the name of
Amen.
the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
Amen.
Dziękuję Polska.
Thank you.